My name is Arthur Irving, and what happened last month taught me something my family never expected me to do. Sometimes the most powerful response to manipulation isn't anger. It's a signed contract. You know that feeling when your parents call you selfish for keeping something that's legally yours. When they demand that you sacrifice everything for the golden child they've already given the world to. That's exactly what happened when they found out I'd inherited my grandmother's $500,000 house. They didn't ask me to share it. They came with a realtor and told me I had two options: sell it to my brother or give me up. Little did they know that I'd already sold the house 3 days ago to someone they never would have expected. When my parents realized who was in that house, my mother started screaming. And when my brother realized who I sold it to, his entire career began to crumble in real time. Before I explain how my brother's CEO became the only person my family couldn't threaten, please like and subscribe if you've heard stories of how you've stood up to family pressure. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. Now let me take you back to the moment my parents thought they had me set up. I didn't sell the house out of spite. That's important. I sold it because I finally understood the pattern I'd been trapped in my entire life. Every time something good came my way, it immediately became negotiable. Every boundary I tried to set became a debate. Every no was treated like a temporary misunderstanding they could correct with pressure, guilt, or threats. The house was the first thing that was ever truly mine. Not shared, not conditional, not something I had to justify. And the moment they realized that, they tried to take it. After that meeting with the realtor, I drove home and sat in my car for nearly an hour. Not angry, not sad, just clear. That rare kind of clarity where everything lines up and you finally see the truth without emotion distorting it. I realized that if I gave in this time, there would always be another time, another demand, another family emergency that somehow only required my sacrifice. So I called someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Marcus Hale. Marcus and I went to college together. He was brilliant, quiet, and relentless in a way that didn't need attention. After graduation, he built a tech company from nothing. I followed his career from a distance. Articles, interviews, promotions, eventually CEO. What my parents didn't know, what Daniel didn't know, was that Marcus was Daniel's CEO. They worked in the same company, but on opposite ends of the hierarchy. Daniel loved name-dropping executives. He loved talking about leadership culture and visibility. He never once mentioned Marcus by name. I'm not sure he even realized who really signed his performance reviews. When I told Marcus I was thinking of selling a property, he didn't push. He asked questions. He listened. He understood immediately what kind of family dynamic I was dealing with. He didn't lowball me. He didn't negotiate aggressively. He offered above market value and said something that stuck with me. I don't want the house if it costs you peace. But if selling it protects you, I'll make sure it does. We closed fast. Clean. Quiet. No drama. No family input. Just signatures and wire transfers. 3 days later, my parents showed up with the realtor. They thought they were early. They thought they were in control. They thought this was the final step where I would cave like I always had. When my mother realized the house was already occupied, she lost it. Not metaphorically. She screamed. Full voice. Right there on the sidewalk. She demanded to know who had the nerve to be inside her mother's house. Then Marcus stepped outside. I've replayed that moment more times than I can count. The way my father's face drained of color. The way my mother stopped mid-sentence. The way Daniel froze when recognition finally hit him. Marcus was calm, polite, professional. He introduced himself like this was any other business interaction. Because for him, it was. For my family, it was a collision. Daniel tried to laugh it off at first. He made a joke. He tried to sound confident. Marcus didn't laugh. He just looked at him the way someone looks at a problem they're about to address privately. That's when the power shifted. My parents tried to argue. They tried to explain. They tried to reframe the situation like it was all a misunderstanding. Marcus didn't engage emotionally. He just stated facts. Ownership. Contracts. Legal standing. End of discussion. And then he said something that I think finally broke the illusion they'd been living under. He said, Arthur didn't do anything wrong. He exercised his legal rights. If you have an issue with that, it's not something you should bring to me, and it's definitely not something you should bring to him. Daniel knew what that meant before my parents did. He knew exactly how replaceable he was. He knew exactly how thin his leverage actually was when family threats didn't work anymore. That was the first time I saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of losing the house. fear of losing control. And standing there, watching it all unfold, I realized something else too. This wasn't revenge. This was insulation. For the first time in my life, I had made a move they couldn't undo, manipulate, or guilt me out of, and they had no idea what to do next. The fallout didn't explode all at once. It cracked slowly, first shock, then denial, then anger, then that desperate bargaining phase where people suddenly pretend they just want to talk things out. My mom was the first to break the silence, not with an apology, not with questions, but with accusation. She said I humiliated them, that I embarrassed the family, that I crossed a line no son should ever cross. She kept repeating the word family like it was a weapon instead of something that ever protected me. My dad stood behind her the whole time, arms crossed, jaw tight. The same posture he used every time he thought authority alone should solve the problem. He finally spoke and said quietly, "You didn't have to do it this way." That almost made me laugh, because this was the only way I could do it. Every other option required their permission, their approval, their control. They left furious but confident. Confident they'd fix it. Confident lawyers or pressure or threats would bend everything back into place like it always had before. They underestimated how permanent a signed contract can be when it's done properly. Within 24 hours, the call started. Not just my parents, aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly remembered my number. Every message sounded different, but said the same thing. "You went too far. This isn't how family handles things. You're tearing everyone apart." No one asked why I felt cornered. No one asked why I sold the house. They only asked why I didn't obey. My brother called that night. His voice was different, careful, controlled. The confidence he always wore had a crack in it. He asked what I told Marcus. He asked if this was personal. He asked if I was trying to ruin him. I told him the truth. I didn't tell Marcus anything about him. I didn't need to. That's when he snapped, accused me of jealousy, bitterness, resentment, said I'd always been this way, quiet until I wasn't, said I stabbed him in the back. So I asked him one question. I asked when exactly he had ever stood in front of me instead of stepping over me. He didn't answer. The next day Marcus called me. No sugarcoating. He said my brother's performance had already been under review before any of this. Leadership had concerns. Entitlement doesn't play well in rooms where results matter. Then he said something that stuck with me. He said, "Your family dynamic explains a lot." Apparently, my brother had a habit of escalating problems upward instead of solving them, leaning on connections, expecting exceptions, assuming protection. That works in families like mine. It doesn't work in companies built on accountability. My parents changed tactics after that. They stopped yelling, stopped threatening, switched to guilt, said my grandmother would be disappointed, said she wanted unity, said she would never have wanted this kind of damage. I reminded them she left the house to me, not to him. Not to both of us, to me. They hated that reminder. They accused me of manipulation, of orchestrating everything, of turning Marcus against them. The irony almost hurt. They were furious that I'd made one decision without consulting them. A week later, my brother was placed on probation at work. He didn't tell them that part. He said he was being targeted, retaliated against, that I poisoned the well. My mom called crying. Not about me, about him. Said he was under stress. Said I needed to fix it, said a good brother would fix it. That's when it finally clicked. Nothing I did would ever be enough unless it benefited him. I told her I wasn't fixing anything, told her he was an adult, told her I wasn't responsible for cushioning his consequences. She hung up. The silence after that was heavy but clean. No more constant messages, no more guilt texts, just quiet. 2 weeks later, my brother was let go, officially restructuring, unofficially accountability catching up. Marcus didn't tell me. I found out through my mom screaming on voicemail saying I destroyed his future, cost him everything. What she didn't say was that his success had always been borrowed, propped up, protected. The house stayed quiet through all of it. The garden bloomed. The walls held. I slept better than I ever had. That's when I realized the house wasn't just an inheritance. It was a boundary made of law and brick, the first thing my family couldn't take from me. And once they realized that, everything else they'd been standing on started to crack. The real collapse didn't happen when my brother lost his job. That was just the moment everyone could see. The real collapse happened when my parents realized they had nothing left to threaten me with. They tried silence first. No calls, no texts, blocked numbers. The kind of silence meant to scare someone back into obedience. The kind they'd used before, when I still needed their approval to breathe normally. This time, it didn't work. Silence only hurts when you're still asking to be chosen. 3 weeks passed. Then 4. Then one afternoon, my dad showed up at the house without warning. Just standing on the porch, hands in his coat pockets, like he still belonged there. I didn't invite him in. He looked older. Not weak, just smaller. Like someone whose authority had finally expired. He said we needed to talk. Said this had gone too far. Said families don't survive when people start acting like strangers. I told him strangers don't threaten to disown you over property. That landed harder than yelling ever could. He admitted they never expected me to stand my ground. Said they thought I'd cave like always. Sell the house. Apologize. Smooth things over. He actually said, this wasn't supposed to end like this. That sentence told me everything. They weren't angry because I hurt them. They were angry because I broke the script. He asked if there was any way to fix it. Asked if I'd help my brother get back on his feet. Asked if I'd talk to Marcus. I said no. Calmly. No anger. No drama. Just no. He looked confused, like he was waiting for emotion he could grab onto. Something to negotiate with. I told him this wasn't revenge. It was distance. Distance I needed to stay whole. He left without arguing. That scared me more than shouting ever did. A few days later, my mom tried again. Different tone. Softer. Nostalgic. She sent photos from when we were kids. Messages about how close we used to be. How I used to follow my brother everywhere. She said she missed her family. I almost replied. Then I remembered she never missed me when I was standing right in front of her. That was the moment the guilt finally shut off. The house started to feel like mine after that. Not just legally. Emotionally. I painted one room. Planted herbs in the garden. Fixed the loose porch rail my grandmother always said she'd get around to. Neighbors stopped by. People who remembered her. They told me she worried about me. Said she knew my parents leaned too hard on one child and not enough on the other. Hearing that hurt. And healed. At the same time, my brother tried contacting me once more. Not angry. Just tired. He said he didn't know who he was without everyone covering for him. Said losing the job exposed things he'd never had to face. I told him I hoped he figured it out. But I wasn't stepping back into the role of collateral damage while he learned. That was the last conversation we had. Months passed. The chaos faded. The house stayed. And something strange happened. I stopped feeling like I had to explain myself to anyone. I didn't need them to understand. I didn't need forgiveness. I didn't need validation. The contract did its job. But so did the boundary. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to my family. I was living. The shift didn't come with fireworks or a dramatic confrontation. It came quietly, the way real change usually does, when you stop waiting for permission and start acting like your life actually belongs to you. Once my parents stopped calling and my brother stopped pretending he was the victim, something opened up inside the silence. Space. Room. Oxygen. I woke up without that familiar tightness in my chest, the one that used to show up every morning like a reminder that I was always behind, always failing some invisible test I didn't even believe in anymore. The house helped, not just because it was solid and quiet and finally mine, but because every room felt honest. There was no performance required. No explaining why I deserved to be there. No defending my choices. I could sit at the kitchen table, coffee going cold, and just exist, without bracing for impact. That alone felt radical. Weeks passed, and I settled into routines, real ones, not survival habits. I fixed the leaking faucet, replaced the broken hinge in the hallway closet, learned which floorboard creaked and which didn't. Neighbors waved. Some stopped to talk. They asked about my grandmother, told stories I'd never heard, about her stubbornness, her generosity, the way she once chased a city inspector off the property with a broom because he threatened to fine her over rose bushes. Hearing those stories filled in gaps my parents never bothered to share because she didn't fit their narrative. She wasn't flashy. She didn't play favorites. She believed in fairness, even when it made people uncomfortable. Slowly, I understood why she chose me. Not because I was better, not because I needed saving, but because she trusted me not to turn her life into leverage. Meanwhile, the fallout on the other side kept unfolding. My brother didn't just lose his job, he lost the insulation that had protected him his entire life. Connections dried up quickly when the shine wore off. Turns out confidence without competence collapses fast. When he couldn't spin his way out of it, people stopped returning calls. He tried freelancing, consulting, networking, anything that let him keep the illusion of status. But without our parents greasing the wheels, nothing stuck. My mother called once, late at night, voice unsteady. She said she was worried about him, said he wasn't sleeping, said he was angry all the time. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't offer solutions. I didn't volunteer to fix it. When she finished, I said I hoped he found his footing. That was it. She waited for more. Advice. Money. Sympathy. Some sign that I'd step back into the role she assigned me. When none came, she ended the call abruptly. A week later, she sent a message asking if I'd consider selling the house back to the family at a fair price. Fair meaning beneficial to them. I didn't respond. I didn't need to argue, because arguing was how they kept control. Every exchange a tug of war, where winning meant exhausting me into compliance. Instead, I focused on my life. I took on more consulting work, not because I needed the money, but because I wanted the momentum. There's something grounding about building something quietly, without anyone watching, without applause, without pressure, just steady progress. I upgraded the home office, replaced the old desk with one that didn't wobble, hung a photo of my grandmother in the corner. She looked like she was smiling, not proud in the way my parents used pride as currency, but content. Like she knew exactly how this would play out. Holidays came and went without drama. No forced dinners. No passive-aggressive toasts. No comparisons. I cooked for myself, invited friends. People who showed up because they wanted to, not because they shared my last name. We laughed, talked about work, about plans, about nothing important and everything at once. It felt normal, in a way I'd never experienced before. No walking on eggshells. No pretending to be smaller so someone else could feel bigger. The strangest part was how quickly my nervous system adjusted once the threat was gone. It's like my body finally believed that peace wasn't temporary, that it wasn't something I had to earn. It was just allowed. What I didn't expect was how much space opened up once I stopped performing for people who never planned to applaud me anyway. It was like I'd been holding my breath for years without realizing it. And now every decision felt lighter, clearer mine. The house settled into a rhythm. Mornings quiet with coffee at the old kitchen table. Afternoons filled with work calls and spreadsheets. Evenings calm in a way my childhood never was. And somewhere in that calm, the truth became obvious. My parents never wanted the house. Not really. They wanted control. They wanted proof that even as an adult I would still fold when they applied pressure, still place my brother's comfort above my own stability, above my grandmother's explicit wishes. That realization hurt, but it also cured something in me. The rumors started spreading after my brother's situation became public. Nothing dramatic at first, just whispers in shared circles, people asking vague questions. Hey, is everything okay over there? The kind of curiosity dressed up as concern. I didn't feed it. I learned quickly that silence is its own kind of power. The less I explained, the more people filled in the gaps themselves, and interestingly, they were far kinder to me than my own family ever had been. A month later, my brother's name quietly disappeared from the company website. No announcement. No farewell post. Just gone. Someone sent me a screenshot. I stared at it for a long time, not with satisfaction, not with guilt, but with a strange neutrality. This wasn't revenge. This was gravity. Actions pulling consequences down on their own schedule. My parents tried one last maneuver after that. They didn't call me directly. They sent a letter. An actual letter. Handwritten, heavy paper, formal tone, as if distance and stationery could restore authority. It talked about family legacy, about mistakes, about forgiveness framed as something I owed them. There was no apology. No acknowledgement of the threats, the manipulation, the attempt to take what wasn't theirs. Just an expectation that time had softened me enough to come back into line. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. Not as evidence. Not as a reminder. Just as a closed chapter. What my grandmother understood, what my parents never did, was that love without respect is just control wearing a nicer outfit. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. People ask me now if I regret selling the house. I don't. Because what I gained wasn't just money or leverage or a clever ending to a bad situation. I gained autonomy. I gained the quiet confidence that comes from finally acting in your own interest without asking permission. Sometimes I drive past the old neighborhood and slow down without meaning to. Not out of longing. Out of gratitude. Gratitude that I learned this lesson when I did. Gratitude that my grandmother trusted me enough to set this entire chain of events in motion. Gratitude that when the moment came, I didn't hesitate. If there's one thing I know now, it's this: boundaries don't ruin families, they reveal them. And once revealed, you finally get to decide what stays in your life and what doesn't. And that decision, more than any inheritance, is what changed everything. After everything settled, I thought the silence would feel empty, but it didn't. It felt earned. For the first time in my life, there was no low-level anxiety humming in the background, no waiting for the next call, the next demand, the next guilt-loaded favor disguised as family obligation. I woke up without checking my phone. I worked without bracing myself for interruptions. I made plans without calculating how they might upset someone else. That freedom was addictive in a quiet, steady way. What surprised me most was how quickly my parents' power evaporated once I stopped reacting. For decades, they had operated on a simple system: apply pressure, escalate guilt, threaten exclusion, wait for compliance. It had always worked because I wanted peace more than I wanted fairness. Once that equation changed, they had nothing left. No leverage, no authority, just noise. They tried indirect routes. Distant relatives suddenly reached out. People who hadn't spoken to me in years asking how I was doing, sliding quickly into concern about family harmony. Old family friends sent messages that sounded supportive but carried the same underlying question: couldn't I just smooth things over? Couldn't I be the bigger person? Couldn't I let it go? I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I replied politely or not at all. Over time, even those messages slowed. It turns out pressure campaigns require momentum, and silence starves them. Meanwhile, the practical consequences for my brother kept unfolding. His professional reputation didn't implode overnight. It eroded. Slowly. Quietly. Invitations stopped coming. Projects he'd once been automatically included in went to other people. He started showing up less in industry conversations. Not because of me. Because people pay attention to character when power is involved, and once doubt enters the room, it doesn't leave easily. The irony wasn't lost on me. He had spent years benefiting from systems he didn't build. Now he was discovering how fragile borrowed status really is. One afternoon, months later, I ran into someone who used to work closely with him. We made small talk, exchanged updates, and then they hesitated before speaking again. For what it's worth, they said, lowering their voice, a lot of people saw what happened. Not just the sale, the way your family handled it. It changed how people viewed him. They didn't sound judgmental, just factual. I thanked them and moved on, feeling neither vindicated nor ashamed, just aware. At home, the house continued to evolve into something that felt like mine, not in a sentimental way, but in a grounded, practical one. I repainted rooms. I fixed things that had been neglected. I planted herbs in the yard because I wanted to, not because anyone expected me to. I worked late some nights and early others, driven by choice instead of obligation. Every improvement felt like a quiet declaration. I am here. I decide. This stays. There were moments when the past tried to resurface. Certain dates, certain memories, the reflex to reach out, to explain, to soften the narrative. Each time, I paused. Each time, I asked myself the same question. Would this bring resolution, or would it reopen a door that cost me years to close? The answer was always the same. So I stayed still. Eventually, my parents did call. Not together. Separately. My mother first. Her voice was unfamiliar without the sharp edge it used to carry. Tired. Uncertain. She talked about missing me. About how things hadn't gone the way anyone expected. About how families go through phases. She never said the words I was waiting for. She never acknowledged the threats. The realtor. The ultimatum. When she paused, clearly expecting reassurance, I didn't rush to fill the silence. I told her I hoped she was well. That I was busy. That I needed space. The call ended politely. Hollowly. My father called weeks later. His approach was different. Direct. Controlled. He spoke about respect. About disappointment. About how things had spiraled unnecessarily. He framed the entire situation as an unfortunate misunderstanding, as if events had simply drifted out of alignment rather than being deliberately forced. I listened. I let him finish. Then I said something I'd never said before. You don't get to rewrite this. The line went quiet. He didn't argue. He didn't apologize. He simply said goodbye. That was the moment I understood something essential. Closure isn't something other people give you. It's something you claim when you stop waiting for permission. As time passed, the story stopped feeling raw. It became something I could look at without flinching. Not because it mattered less, but because it no longer defined me. I was no longer the son who needed approval, or the brother caught in comparison, or the relative expected to yield. I was just a man who made a decision and lived with it. Every so often, someone new would hear a version of what happened and ask if I'd do it again. If I'd still sell. If I'd still stand my ground knowing what it cost. I never had to think about the answer. Yes, without hesitation. Because the cost of compliance would have been higher. It would have been invisible, ongoing, permanent. This cost was finite. It hurt, and then it healed. I think about my grandmother often. Not with sadness. With clarity. She didn't just leave me property. She left me an example. She showed me that quiet strength outlasts noise, that preparation beats confrontation, that the right move made at the right time doesn't need applause to be effective. She trusted me to choose myself. And I did. If there's anything this experience taught me, it's that family pressure only works when you agree to carry it. The moment you set it down, the people who relied on it have to face themselves. Some grow, some don't. Either way, you're no longer responsible for cushioning the impact. Life now is steady, unremarkable in the best way. No dramatic confrontations, no surprise visits, no threats disguised as concern. Just work, rest, plans, progress. And sometimes, late at night, I sit in the quiet and realize how far I've come. Not financially, not socially, internally, because the real inheritance wasn't the house. It was the moment I stopped being afraid to lose people who never wanted me to stand on my own. By the time the dust fully settled, I realized something else had changed too. Something quieter but more permanent than the house or the money or the fallout. I had stopped bracing myself. For most of my life, I moved through conversations with my family like someone walking through a room full of tripwires, measuring words, anticipating reactions, adjusting my tone to keep things from exploding. I didn't even know I was doing it anymore. It was muscle memory, survival behavior disguised as politeness. And then one day I noticed it was gone. I could think about them without feeling that tightness in my chest. I could hear their names without rehearsing arguments in my head. That absence told me more than any apology ever could. People assume moments like this end with dramatic reconciliation or total estrangement. The truth is less cinematic and more realistic. It ends with distance, with space, with a slow recalibration of who has access to you and who doesn't. No shouting matches, no final speeches, just a gradual understanding that the old dynamics don't work anymore and you're no longer available to maintain them. My brother tried reaching out once. Not directly, through a mutual acquaintance who framed it as concern. He's having a hard time. He's under a lot of stress. He feels like things got out of hand. That phrasing was interesting. Things got out of hand. As if this were weather. As if decisions hadn't been made. As if pressure hadn't been applied deliberately, confidently, with the expectation that I would fold like I always had. I thanked the person for letting me know and said I wished him well. That was it. No message sent. No bridge rebuilt. Not out of spite, but because I finally understood that access is not an obligation. What people rarely talk about is how uncomfortable it makes others when you stop playing your assigned role. When you're the reasonable one, the flexible one, the one who compromises, your compliance becomes part of the family's emotional infrastructure. They rely on it. They build around it. The moment you step out of that role, the whole structure wobbles, and suddenly you're the problem, not because you did something wrong, but because you stopped making things easy for everyone else. I saw that discomfort ripple outward. Extended family members who had quietly benefited from the status quo didn't know where to stand anymore. Some avoided me entirely. Others tested boundaries, fishing for reassurance that I was still the same, still safe, still willing to absorb discomfort so no one else had to. I wasn't rude. I wasn't cold. I was neutral. And neutrality, I learned, feels threatening to people who are used to control. Meanwhile, my own life kept expanding into the space I'd created. Work improved, not in a dramatic promotion sense, but in focus. I took on projects I'd been putting off for years. I said no to things that drained me and yes to things that challenged me. I slept better. I thought clearer. The background noise of obligation had been replaced by intention. That alone felt like success. There was a moment one evening when I caught myself smiling for no reason. Just standing in the kitchen, listening to nothing, doing nothing. It startled me. That kind of ease had been rare before. I realized then how much energy I'd spent managing other people's expectations and how much of that energy I had back now. Every so often, I replayed the key moments in my head, not obsessively, but analytically. The realtor standing in my living room like an executioner. The certainty in my parents' voices when they gave me the ultimatum. The way they framed it as a lesson, as if compliance were maturity and resistance were selfishness. And then the look on their faces when reality didn't bend. When authority failed. When they realized I had acted without them, planned without them, protected myself without their approval. That look wasn't anger. It was shock. The shock of losing control over a narrative they'd owned for decades. That image didn't bring me satisfaction the way people might expect. It brought me clarity. Because in that moment, I saw them clearly too. Not as villains, not as monsters, but as people who had never learned how to love without leverage. Everything in their world came with conditions. Praise came with expectations. Support came with strings. Belonging came with obedience. Once I saw that pattern, I couldn't unsee it. And I couldn't step back into it either. I thought a lot about how easily this could have gone the other way. How close I came to folding. How many versions of my life ended with me giving up the house just to keep the peace. Just to avoid conflict. Just to remain included. That version of me would have smiled at holidays while resenting every second. He would have watched his brother benefit again while being told it was for the good of the family. He would have internalized the message that his needs mattered less because he could endure more. And he would have called that love. Walking away from that path felt like grief at first. Grief for the family I thought I had. Grief for the approval I never received. Grief for the fantasy that someday things would balance out on their own. But grief, unlike guilt, passes if you let it. And on the other side of it was something steadier. Acceptance. Not acceptance of what they did. Acceptance of who they are. And of who I am when I stopped trying to earn a place at a table that was never set for me. I stopped explaining myself. That was another shift. Early on, I felt the urge to justify every decision, to provide context, to make sure everyone understood my reasoning. That impulse faded when I realized explanation is often just another form of permission seeking. I didn't need them to understand. I needed them to stop interfering. And they had. There's a particular kind of peace that comes from knowing no one can threaten you with exclusion anymore, because you've already survived it. Once you've been willing to lose people, their leverage disappears. Not because you stop caring, but because you stop negotiating your worth. I won't pretend there aren't moments of sadness. There are. Certain memories still sting. Certain holidays still feel quieter than they should. But that quiet isn't hostile. It's honest. It reflects reality instead of a performance. And I prefer it that way. If there's one thing I would tell anyone in a similar position, it's this. You don't owe consistency to people who were inconsistent with you. You don't owe sacrifice to people who confuse entitlement with love. And you don't owe access to anyone who only values you when you're compliant. Standing up for yourself doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like preparation, like paperwork, like timing, like choosing a path that doesn't require anyone's approval to work. That kind of strength doesn't announce itself. It just holds. I didn't set out to teach anyone a lesson. I set out to protect my future. If others learn something in the process, that's on them. My responsibility ended the moment I chose myself. And if that makes me selfish in their story, so be it. I finally learned that I don't have to live inside someone else's version of me. After everything went quiet, after the phone stopped ringing and the group chats went dead, I started noticing how deeply my family's expectations had shaped my instincts. I'd catch myself hesitating before making small decisions, like buying furniture or planning a weekend, as if someone might object. It took time to unlearn that reflex, the one that asks for permission where none is required. Freedom isn't a switch you flip, it's a muscle you have to train, and at first it aches because you've never used it properly. What surprised me most was how fast my nervous system adapted once the pressure was gone. I didn't wake up bracing for conflict anymore. I didn't rehearse conversations in my head while showering. I didn't feel the need to justify my choices to imaginary critics. That constant low-grade anxiety I thought was just part of adulthood slowly dissolved, and in its place was something unfamiliar but solid, calm. People around me noticed before I did. A coworker asked if I'd started therapy because I seemed lighter. A friend said I laughed more, not the polite laugh, the real one. Even my posture changed. When you stop shrinking to fit other people's comfort, your body takes up space without asking. I also started seeing my family dynamics reflected everywhere once I had distance from them. At work, in friend groups, even in strangers' stories online. The golden child pattern. The scapegoat. The peacemaker. The one who's told they're strong so they can be ignored. It's unsettling how common it is. How many families quietly function on imbalance while pretending it's normal. And how often the person who finally refuses to carry the weight gets labeled as the problem. I thought about my brother more than I expected, not with anger, but with a strange mix of pity and clarity. He wasn't evil. He was shaped, conditioned to expect accommodation, to equate love with compliance, to see other people's sacrifices as natural extensions of his needs. That kind of upbringing doesn't prepare you for resistance. It prepares you for collapse when resistance finally appears. Watching his confidence unravel wasn't satisfying, but it was revealing. For the first time, I saw how much of his success depended on everyone else bending around him. There was a moment, weeks later, when I ran into someone who knew my parents socially. They hesitated before speaking, clearly unsure which version of the story I believed in. Then they said, carefully, "Your family's been having a rough time." I nodded and replied, "I hope they find what they're looking for." It wasn't sarcasm. It was distance, the kind that doesn't need to defend itself. I stopped correcting people when they misunderstood the situation. I let rumors exist without chasing them. If someone thought I was cold, ungrateful, dramatic, so be it. I learned that controlling the narrative is exhausting, and people who want to misunderstand you will do so no matter how clearly you explain. Letting go of that need felt like setting down a heavy bag I'd been carrying for years. With the extra mental space, I started asking myself questions I'd never had room for before. What do I actually want? Not what looks reasonable or acceptable, but what feels right. Where do I want to live? How do I want my days to feel? What kind of relationships energize me instead of draining me? These weren't dramatic revelations, more like slow realizations that stacked on top of each other until a new picture formed. I also thought a lot about my grandmother, about how quietly she'd watched everything, how she'd chosen patience over confrontation, strategy over speeches. People romanticize explosive justice, but what she gave me was something better. Options, security, time. She didn't rescue me. She positioned me so I could rescue myself. That's a kind of love that doesn't demand gratitude, only growth. Every now and then, I imagined an alternate timeline where she'd told me everything in advance, where she'd warned me, prepared me emotionally, maybe even coached me through it. But then I realized that wouldn't have worked. I needed to reach the point where I was ready to act, not just informed. Strength given too early can feel like pressure. She waited until I was strong enough to choose myself without flinching. The house, the money, the contracts, they were tools. Useful ones, yes, but not the point. The point was the shift. The moment I stopped negotiating my value. The moment I stopped hoping fairness would arrive on its own. The moment I accepted that love without respect isn't love, it's control wearing a softer mask. I became more selective with people after that. Not guarded, just intentional. I paid attention to how people reacted when I said no, when I disagreed, when I didn't immediately accommodate. The ones who stayed calm, curious, respectful, those were the ones worth keeping close. The ones who pushed, guilt, or mocked revealed themselves quickly. I didn't argue with them. I just stepped back. It's strange how much clarity comes from one decisive act. Not because it fixes everything, but because it resets your internal compass. Once you know you can protect yourself, really know it, you stop tolerating things that drain you. You stop confusing endurance with virtue. You stop waiting for permission to live your own life. I don't know what the long-term future looks like with my family. Maybe there will be reconciliation one day, maybe not. But I do know this. If it happens, it will be on equal footing, without ultimatums, without leverage, without the expectation that I fold to maintain peace. And if it never happens, I'll still be okay. That realization alone was worth everything it took to get here. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing your life is yours. Not borrowed, not conditional, not provisional. Yours. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't need validation. It just needs consistency. And that's what I'm building now. One calm decision at a time. By the time the house stopped being a battleground and became just a place again, I realized the real war had never been about property. It had been about control, identity, and obedience. The house was just the lever they used when they realized guilt alone wasn't enough anymore. Once that lever snapped, everything else followed. My parents didn't call for weeks after the sale became irreversible. Not because they were processing, because they were strategizing. Silence was their favorite weapon when yelling failed. Growing up, silence meant punishment. It meant you'd crossed a line and now had to sit with uncertainty until you apologized. This time, the silence didn't work. I slept fine. I worked. I cooked. I lived. That probably scared them more than any argument ever could. The first crack came from my aunt. She texted something neutral at first, asking how I was doing, then slipped in the real question. Did you really sell the house without telling anyone? I replied honestly, yes, it was mine. She didn't respond for a day, then sent, your parents are devastated. I stared at that word for a long time. Devastated. Not sad for me. Not reflective. Devastated that their plan failed. I didn't reply. Then came the calls from extended family members who had never once shown up for my birthdays, graduations, or hard moments, suddenly very invested in family unity. They all used the same language, like it had been copied and pasted. You went too far. You embarrassed them. Money changes people. I noticed none of them said they were wrong. That told me everything. Meanwhile, my brother's situation was unraveling faster than I expected. When your confidence is built on the assumption that everyone will always adjust for you, even small resistance feels like betrayal. He started missing deadlines. His presentations became sloppy. He argued with his manager, then with HR. I didn't hear this directly from him. I heard it through the same grapevine that suddenly cared so much about my moral character. One afternoon, I ran into someone I hadn't seen since college. We talked casually until my brother's name came up. They paused, then said carefully, "Rough time for him lately." I nodded. That was all. I didn't explain. I didn't defend. I didn't gloat. Silence, used correctly, is powerful. My parents eventually tried a different tactic. They called and spoke softly, almost kindly, like none of the threats had ever happened. They asked if we could talk like adults. I agreed to meet in a public place, on neutral ground. No house. No leverage. Just conversation. They arrived together, coordinated as always. My mother looked tired. My father looked irritated that tiredness hadn't produced compliance. They didn't apologize. They never do. Instead, they framed everything as misunderstanding. Stress. Fear. Concern. You know how much we worry, my mother said. You know how sensitive your brother is. That word again. Sensitive. Code for protected. Code for excused. I listened. I didn't interrupt. Then I said something they weren't prepared for. I said, I'm not discussing the house. That decision is final. We can talk about our relationship, or we can end this conversation. They stared at me like I'd spoken another language. My father asked, "Are you threatening us?" I said no. I said I was setting terms. He didn't like that distinction. When they realized the house was off the table, the conversation shifted. Suddenly, it was about family values, respect, loyalty. I asked one question that ended the meeting. Can you name one time you defended me the way you've defended him? Neither answered. My mother looked away. My father changed the subject. I stood up, paid for my coffee, and left. That was the moment I understood something important. Closure doesn't come from resolution. It comes from clarity. I didn't need them to agree with me. I needed to stop waiting for them to. Weeks passed. Life normalized. I got better at noticing peace. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet one. The absence of tension. The lack of rehearsed conversations in my head. The feeling that my choices didn't need approval to be valid. Then my brother called. Not to apologize. Not to reconnect. He called because he needed something. That's how it always starts. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He tried charm. Said he missed me. Said family was important. Then he mentioned how unfair things had become. How I had power now. How I could help. I let him talk. Then I said, "You're asking me to fix a situation you helped create." He said I was being dramatic. I said no, I was being accurate. When I didn't offer anything else, he got angry. Accused me of enjoying his downfall. I told him the truth. I didn't cause this. I just stopped preventing it. That ended the call. Later that night, I thought about how often I'd been told I was strong. Strong enough to wait. Strong enough to sacrifice. Strong enough to absorb disappointment quietly. Strength, I learned, had been used as an excuse to neglect me. Real strength is choosing yourself when no one claps. The house had become more than shelter. It was proof. Proof that foresight beats force. That preparation beats pleading. That legality beats manipulation. My grandmother had known exactly what kind of family she was dealing with, and she'd responded the only way that works with people like them. She didn't argue. She outmaneuvered. I kept one of her old letters on my desk. Not framed, not dramatic, just there. A reminder that being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you believe it. By the end of that month, the family narrative had shifted. I was no longer the irresponsible one. I was the difficult one, the cold one, the one who changed. I accepted that role gladly, because it meant I was no longer controllable. And the irony is this. The moment I stopped chasing their approval was the moment I finally felt like myself. Not the version they tolerated. The real one. That's when I understood something else too. This story wasn't about revenge. Revenge is emotional, temporary, loud. This was about permanence. About removing myself from a system that required my silence to function. What came next would force my family to confront consequences they could no longer outsource. And unlike the house, unlike the money, unlike the contracts, those consequences couldn't be sold, transferred, or undone. And that's where everything truly changed. What surprised me most after everything settled wasn't the anger or the fallout. It was how quickly people revealed who they really were once there was nothing left to take from me. When the house stopped being a bargaining chip, the calls slowed. When my brother's job stopped being secure, the sympathy dried up. When my parents realized guilt no longer worked, they switched to reputation management. That's when the story started changing. I wasn't selfish anymore. I was unstable. I wasn't independent. I was ungrateful. According to them, I'd been manipulated by outsiders, poisoned against my own family, corrupted by money. They told anyone who would listen that I'd changed, that success had made me cold, that I'd forgotten where I came from. The irony was almost funny. I hadn't changed at all. I'd just stopped shrinking. A cousin I barely knew tried to stage an intervention over dinner, framed as concern. He said families fight, but blood matters more. I asked him why blood had only mattered when someone wanted something from me. He didn't have an answer. The conversation ended early. My parents attempted one final maneuver, the public apology that isn't actually an apology. They posted a vague message online about forgiveness and betrayal, and how sometimes children forget sacrifices made for them. No names. Plenty of implication. I didn't respond. Silence again. It worked better than anything else. Behind the scenes, things were unraveling faster. My brother had officially been placed on leave pending review. Not announced, not dramatic, just quietly removed from meetings and projects. He texted me late one night, angry, scattered, blaming everyone except himself. He said if I had just sold the house to him, none of this would have happened. I replied once, "If your career depends on my obedience, it was never stable." He didn't text again. My parents started asking mutual contacts about legal options. Could they contest the sale? Could they claim coercion? Could they claim emotional distress? Every answer came back the same. No. Everything was clean. Everything was final. My grandmother had planned better than they ever gave her credit for. That realization seemed to break something in them. They'd always believed authority was permanent. That being parents meant automatic leverage. That being louder meant being right. Contracts don't care about hierarchy. Neither do consequences. For the first time, they were powerless, and they didn't know how to exist without control. I noticed something else during that time. The absence of anxiety. I used to rehearse conversations in my head constantly, imagining arguments, preparing defenses, bracing for disappointment. That noise stopped. I didn't need to justify myself anymore. The house sale wasn't just a transaction. It was an exit. One evening, I sat in the quiet and realized I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt anymore. I was done. And being done felt better than being vindicated ever could. Then the unexpected happened. My mother showed up alone. No warning. No message. Just her car in the driveway and her standing there like she wasn't sure which role to play. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She looked tired. Smaller somehow. She asked if we could talk. I let her in. She walked around like she was visiting a stranger's home, touching nothing, looking everywhere except at me. She said your father doesn't understand what happened. She said your brother is struggling. She said family shouldn't end like this. Not once did she say sorry. I listened. Then I said something she wasn't prepared for. This didn't end suddenly. It ended slowly. Over years. She didn't argue. That told me she knew. She asked what it would take to fix things. I told her the truth. Accountability. Not explanations. Not excuses. Accountability. She said that would be hard. I said I knew. That was the conversation. When she left, I didn't feel relief or sadness. I felt confirmation. Confirmation that the distance wasn't cruelty. It was necessary. A few days later, news finally broke quietly in industry circles. My brother was out. Officially. No severance. No recommendation. The reason wasn't public, but everyone understood. Reputation matters until it doesn't. Once trust cracks, everything follows. My parents stopped calling after that. What I didn't expect was how peaceful it felt to watch consequences unfold without interfering. For the first time, I wasn't cleaning up messes that weren't mine. I wasn't smoothing over tension. I wasn't absorbing blame to keep the peace. I was just living. The house became home in a way it never could have if I'd given it up out of fear. Every room felt earned. Every quiet morning felt deliberate. I started planning long-term, not defensively, but intentionally. And that's when I realized something else. This wasn't over yet. Because when people lose control, they don't always stop. Sometimes they escalate. Sometimes they make mistakes. And sometimes, those mistakes expose truths they were never meant to. I didn't know it yet, but the next move my family made wouldn't be about the house, or the money, or my brother's job. It would be about protecting themselves. And in trying to do that, they were about to reveal something far bigger than any inheritance ever could. That revelation was coming. And when it did, there would be no contracts left to hide behind. I didn't hear from my parents for a while after that. Not a text, not a voicemail, not even one of those half-hearted messages pretending nothing happened. At first I thought they were regrouping. Then I realized something more unsettling. They were scared. Not of me, but of exposure. When control fails, fear takes its place. The shift became obvious when a mutual acquaintance reached out quietly, not with gossip, but with a question. Hey, can I ask you something off the record? That phrase always means something's already in motion. He told me my parents had been asking about documents, old ones, things related to my grandmother's estate that went beyond the house. He didn't know details, only that they seemed desperate to make sure certain things stayed buried. That was the first time I wondered if the house had never been the real issue. I contacted the attorney who handled the sale, not because I was worried about legality, but because I wanted clarity. I asked one question. Was there anything unusual in my grandmother's files? He paused longer than necessary. Then he said yes. There were supplemental documents, personal letters, records she insisted be archived, but not released unless specific conditions were met. Conditions that hadn't been triggered. Until now. Apparently, the moment my parents tried to coerce me, those conditions activated. I didn't know what that meant yet, but I knew my grandmother well enough to understand one thing. She never acted without intention. A few days later, my father finally called. Not to reconcile. Not to explain. He demanded we meet. His tone wasn't angry. It was urgent. That alone told me more than words ever could. I agreed, but again, on neutral ground, with witnesses nearby. He arrived alone this time. No performance, no speeches. He got straight to the point. He asked if I'd accessed any additional documents related to the estate. I said no. That was true. I hadn't yet. But the fact that he asked told me everything. He tried to frame it as concern, as legal housekeeping, as protecting the family from misunderstandings. I asked him why he was afraid of misunderstandings if everything had been handled honestly. He didn't answer. Then he said something that changed how I saw the last 30 years. He said, "You don't understand how much damage this could do. Not to me. Not to us. To him." That's when it clicked. The house wasn't leverage. It was a test. And my grandmother had anticipated exactly how they'd fail it. After that meeting, I requested access to the archived materials. The attorney didn't hesitate. He said he'd been waiting for that call. When I arrived at his office, he handed me a sealed folder and told me to take my time. He also told me, carefully, that once I read what was inside, there would be no going back to the version of my family I thought I knew. He wasn't exaggerating. The documents weren't dramatic. No secret accounts. No criminal confessions. Just patterns. Financial records. Correspondence. Evidence of decisions made quietly, repeatedly, always favoring one child at the expense of another, always justified, always rationalized. What shocked me wasn't that my brother had been favored. It was how deliberately I'd been excluded. College funds redirected. Trust allocations altered. Recommendations withheld. Even letters from my grandmother to me that had never been delivered, intercepted under the guise of family management. It wasn't neglect. It was strategy. My grandmother had known, and she'd documented everything. I sat there reading until my hands went numb. Not angry, not devastated, just clear. Clear in a way that stripped away every remaining excuse I'd ever made for them. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was design. When I left the office, I didn't feel like confronting anyone. I felt like stepping back and letting the truth do what it does best. Surface on its own. That night, my brother called again. He sounded different. Less arrogant. More panicked. He said he'd heard rumors. Asked if I knew anything. I told him I knew enough. He asked if I was going to destroy the family. I said no. I wasn't going to protect lies anymore. The next morning, my parents' lawyer reached out. Not friendly. Not hostile. Careful. He asked if I'd be willing to discuss a confidentiality agreement. That was the moment I understood how deep this went. You don't ask for silence unless you're afraid of sound. I didn't answer him. Instead, I reread one of my grandmother's letters, one that had been returned to her unopened. In it, she wrote, "When people show you who they are through actions, believe them. And when they try to silence you, ask yourself what they're afraid of." I finally understood what she'd given me wasn't just a house or leverage or protection. She'd given me timing. The truth was already moving. I didn't need to push it. I just needed to stop blocking it. Because what was coming next wouldn't be about inheritance or resentment or even justice. It would be about accountability. And once that door opened, there would be no way for my family to close it again. The fallout didn't arrive like an explosion. It arrived like gravity, slow, inevitable, impossible to escape once it started pulling. I didn't make announcements. I didn't send messages. I didn't threaten anyone. I did nothing. And that's what made it unstoppable. Within a week, my parents' silence broke, not with apologies, but with consequences. My father's business partner quietly stepped away. Then another. A deal that had been basically guaranteed suddenly stalled. My mother stopped calling entirely, not out of dignity, but out of fear that anything she said could be documented, misquoted, used. They'd spent decades controlling narratives. Now they didn't control the audience. My brother lasted the longest. He tried denial first, telling people it was a misunderstanding, a family disagreement blown out of proportion. That worked for about 3 days. Then his CEO called him in for a closed-door meeting. I know because the meeting ended with him leaving the building carrying a box instead of a briefcase. Turns out, when your company's CEO owns the house you tried to strong-arm your brother into selling, your credibility evaporates fast. Especially when your professional reputation was already built more on association than substance. He wasn't fired publicly. He was quietly removed. Which is worse in corporate circles. No scandal. No explanation. Just absence. He texted me once after that. Just one line. I didn't know it would go this far. I stared at it for a long time before replying. Neither did I, but I knew it would go somewhere. My parents tried one final move. Mediation. They framed it as healing. Closure. Family unity. But every sentence was about damage control, not remorse. They wanted agreements, boundaries, silence. They wanted me back in my place, just with nicer language. I declined. Not angrily. Not dramatically. I simply said no. And that was the moment everything shifted for good. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting. I was deciding. I stayed in the house. Not as a symbol. Not as revenge. As a home. I fixed the porch railing my grandmother always meant to repair. I replanted the garden she loved. I kept her furniture, not because it was valuable, but because it was honest. Every morning I drank coffee in the same chair she used to sit in, the one place in my childhood where no one compared me to anyone else. The house didn't fix my past. It clarified it. I stopped seeing myself as the difficult one, the selfish one, the problem. I was simply the one who didn't fit the script they wrote. And instead of rewriting myself, I stepped out of it. Months later, I heard my parents were moving. Downsizing. Starting fresh, according to relatives. Funny how starting fresh always comes after consequences. My brother moved cities. New job. Lower title. Fewer people who knew his last name. He never reached out again. And me? I didn't win. I didn't defeat anyone. I didn't get revenge. I got peace. I learned that family pressure only works when you're still asking for permission. The moment you stop needing approval, manipulation loses its teeth. Contracts outlast guilt. Boundaries outlast arguments. And silence, when chosen, is stronger than any explanation. My grandmother understood that. She didn't leave me a weapon. She left me an exit. If you're listening to this and you're standing at that same crossroads, where keeping the peace means losing yourself, understand this. You are not required to sacrifice your future to make someone else comfortable. You are not selfish for protecting what's legally, morally, and rightfully yours. And you don't owe loyalty to people who only value you when you comply. Sometimes the strongest thing you can say is nothing at all. Just a signature, a decision, a closed door, and a life that finally belongs to you. If this story hit close to home, you're not alone. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. And remember this, the best response to manipulation isn't anger. It's independence. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below and don't miss more thrilling stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.